and welcome into this week's book club episode of Star Wars Aftermath Empire's End. If you are unfamiliar with this series, basically we take a Star Wars book and discuss it a couple of chapters at a time. You can go to this playlist and I'll take you back to the beginning for this book, or since this is the third book in the Aftermath trilogy, you can join us from the very beginning with the playlist for the first book, which you can find by clicking here. So with that, we'll get into Christophsis. Interlude 4 is one of my favorite interludes in the trilogy. This interlude is one of those interludes where I really wish sometimes that these interludes were either more of the story or the story, had their own stories, that these could get expanded off into other books. There's a lot of really interesting things at play. So you have Adar, who is Adar, however you want to say it, who's the child of a woman who started a pilgrim group, and it's part of the Church of the Force. The Church of the Force is a group started by Lor San Tekka, who you see in Star Wars The Force Awakens. So Adar is in this, super religious group, and he himself is not necessarily religious. He's kind of forced into it because his mom's there, but he's surrounded by these other very devout believers of the Force and what the Force means. What I think is interesting is one of the pilgrims in this group is a droid. In new canon, especially around the time of Solo's release, they really started pushing stories that had droid sentience in it. The idea that droids are actual, people, that they're not just robots, which is an interesting topic unto itself. This, with Aftermath, was maybe not one of the first times, but definitely kind of early on. They really started pushing it in new canon in general, but really especially around L3's character, and as they were setting up L3's character and that they knew they were going that direction with the character. The other kind of interesting thing that's going on here for me is in Star Wars is this idea of, in Star Wars, almost everyone believes in the Force. I mean, you have cases like Han Solo who doesn't believe in it, but pretty much anybody who's met a Jedi or a Sith or a Force user in general kind of believes that the Force exists, right? You don't watch somebody levitate something or shoot lightning out of their hands and go, I'm not sure this Force thing is legit. It's kind of like if you lived in the Marvel Universe, as soon as you saw Thor, you would believe in superpowers or something. It's harder to do kind of faith corollaries with Earth, where you have people of various religions and faiths, but, where we live in this time today, there's not this kind of, planet-wide understanding on whether or not a god is real, and if there is one or not. I don't mean to get preachy on you guys, but in the Star Wars universe, that's different. Because most people are aware of the Force. So the belief chain kind of comes with Adar, where he believes that the Force exists, but that it doesn't necessarily exist for him. Like, it exists for people who are Jedi, or exists for people who can use it, but if you can't use it, it might as well not exist. And this seems to be probably, I would assume this is a very common belief by people who are not necessarily what we would call Force sensitive. But to me, it's kind of funny because it creates this corollary where, on the one hand, they have to do it this way because there is very clear evidence that the Force exists within Star Wars, and yet it creates this type of thing that I can relate to as a person of faith, because it's a very common thing that people of faith go through, where they think that, God exists, but he does things for, other people who are more devout than me. And, I can kind of connect to Adar, not because I don't believe, but because I struggle with that. I think God's a thing, but, he's out there doing stuff for other people, not me. And I'm like, that's through what I'm taught in my own faith. And again, I don't mean to get preachy on you guys, but, that would be wrong. And so this is also kind of presented as Adar not fully understanding the beliefs he's been raised on. And it's kind of interesting because it's both different, because the Star Wars universe is different, and yet because it's different, it creates this dynamic that I personally can connect to, which might be different than what somebody else can do. So it's just kind of, I don't know, I just find this particular one interesting. And it's both, the story is both really inspiring and really depressing at the same time, because it's this story of these people who are trying to return kyber crystals that the Death Star took, or the Death Star, it's people trying to return kyber crystals that the Empire took back to a crystal cave on Christophsis. In the end, they get to return the crystals, but like everyone dies. You know, it ends with Adder like watching like the sermons, if you will, as he knows that he's trapped, and I can't really tell if in the end he found faith or if in the end he's just kind of like so deranged and whatnot that it's like all he has. Depending on how you interpret the ending, it's either sad but inspiring or just absolutely soul-crushingly depressing. I don't know, it's just interesting, but it is a really good story in of itself. And it's something where I would have loved to have spent more time with these characters and seen this fleshed out more. Just from a canon note, though, I like that, I think it was in a sermon's passage, but somebody was talking about like all the bad things that have happened in the galaxy. So you have the legacy of Darth Vader, and the legacy of the Death Star, and the legacy of whatever, and somebody says the legacy of Galen Erso in a negative connotation, and that I realized that we know Galen had this long con to make the Death Star weak from what we saw in Rogue One. But then I realized the galaxy doesn't necessarily know this. And a lot of the rebels that knew this died on Scarif. I mean, yes, they knew that there were plans for the Death Star that exposed a weakness, but not everyone knew that that weakness was intentional. And so that kind of hit me, is that Galen did all of this that set up Rogue One and never necessarily got credit for it. And that's something that kind of added, I think that will add weight to subsequent viewings of Rogue One. So, Chapter 17. In this, we kind of come right back in the middle of the action. Nora and Bones are freeing prisoners from their kind of Thunderdome place that they were staying. And then they get out to escape. They're rolling through the dunes. They think they're getting chased, and it turns out they are getting chased, but they're getting chased by Jazz. So then they get rescued. Nora and Jazz are reunited. Jazz is aware that Nora now has Bones. And they had this conversation about what they're going to do, right? Do they go back, which is the responsible thing to do, or Jazz knows where Sloane is, and do they continue on after Sloane? Now, there's a really interesting dynamic here that I really, really like, which is Jazz, of course, sees Sloane, so she's seen Brenton as well, but Jazz doesn't know what Brenton looks like. So basically, Jazz and Nora are going after Sloane for vengeance, and Nora has no idea that Brenton is with her. So I found myself as a reader, on the one hand, thinking, man, I just hope, Jazz and Nora are so beat up. They've gone through so much. I just want them to return home and get back and bring back what they know, and maybe they can help with this whole, getting the Republic to attack Jakku thing. But Brenton's there, and I also want Nora to go get Brenton, and Nora doesn't know, and so I have this, I don't want Nora to go because I don't want her to give in to vengeance, but I do want her to go because I want her to go get her husband. And it's this really interesting kind of motivation dynamic. And this is something I think these books can do well. It's kind of set you up to feel that you want different things for different reasons, and it kind of leaves you torn. And this, I think, is a very effective kind of emotional stake to put in the story at this point. Another interesting kind of writing note about this chapter is in the past, through the past 3 books, anytime we've had a chapter that's end of a part of a book chapter, maybe not anytime, but most of the time, it's let's visit everyone. Let's see what this part of the team is doing, and this part of the team is doing, and this part of the team is doing, and what the villain's doing, and let's jump all over. And then we have a big twist, and that ends the part. And here, we've been spending a lot of time with Jazz and Nora. Yes, we got to see Rax in there a little bit, but we've been spending a lot of time the last couple of chapters with Jazz and Nora. And we end with Jazz and Nora, and then we're going to kind of pick up in 18 somewhere else. But this book has been keeping you way more targeted than the first 2 books. You've been spending way more time with a particular set of characters for several chapters, really making you miss what the other characters are doing, and wanting to go back to that, and then you switch, but then you stay with them for a long time, and you're like, oh man, I'm really glad to see what Singer's doing, but what are Jazz and Nora up to? Oh, and it's really making you feel that distance between the characters, because it's making you stay with a particular section for a long period of time, which I think is a very effective tool for making you feel that separation, because as a reader, you don't necessarily feel that. And I don't know if I would feel this separation as vividly if it weren't for the writing style of these books so far. Like, you needed the jumping around of the first two books to feel the kind of stationary, for lack of a better word, feeling from these chapters in this book, and I think it's doing that very effectively. So this is the chapter that ends part 2, and we go on to part 3. Chapter 18, we see Jom. So this is the first time we've seen Jom in this book, and we are almost halfway through. He's been mentioned earlier in the book, but he hasn't been in it. Jom has kind of been separate. And so here we start out 3, and we're seeing what was previously, a major player in the crew in Life Debt, now finally appearing in this novel. And there's kind of an irony to it, because Singer is slowly trying to, sober up. Jom has kind of drank himself into a stupor. And so these two characters are kind of going through this reversal, which is something Singer points out. In a way, this chapter actually kind of felt like, when you're watching a TV show and a character leaves a show because they got a new show, and so they're not there for a season and a half, but the show they went to fails, and so then they come back to the original show a season and a half later, and it's like, wow, the big reveal that the character is back. Back when those type of things were reveals, because we could keep secrets on television. That was what that moment felt like, in a way. I was like, oh, Jom's back from the pilot he tried to start that didn't get picked up. It's nice to see you again, Jom. How are you doing? I also think it's funny that Singer can only wake him up by basically torturing him, which was both amusing and kind of disturbing at the same time. Basically, we find out that Jom is a wreck because he's sad because Jazz has left him. He has real feelings for her, and we're kind of finally seeing them. And he's working, but he doesn't really want to do much else besides work. We find out he got an honorable discharge because of what happened on Kashyyyk. He does say that he might have been able to be let back into the military, but he didn't ask. This goes to this kind of main character privilege in a way that a lot of characters have. Wedge didn't get kicked out of the military. He got pushed to a desk job, but he wasn't necessarily overly punished, and that's kind of what happened to Jom, is Jom got a medal and then got kicked out, because at the end of the day, they weren't supposed to do it, but they did it. And it kind of, we're still seeing the after effects, the aftermath, if you will, of that Kashyyyk mission. He feels this emptiness, he does want to work, but he doesn't know what to do. He's going to presumably find new purpose now, trying to save Jazz. But where we're left in the chapter is that Singer says they're not necessarily going to go in guns blazing, that they need Jom's new connections as a employee, or rather a kind of regular guard, private security for the Senate, and that they're going to use that in some way. We get to wait and find out and see what goes from there. But honestly, that's really what I have to say about these chapters. Just from a writing perspective, they were very interesting, very telling for what this book is doing. I really enjoyed seeing that. It's kind of fun. These are things I don't necessarily notice when I'm reading a book, like if I'm just sitting down burning through the pages, but a thing that kind of reveals itself as you're taking chapters, a couple of chapters at a time. I can kind of think about, okay, what purpose are these chapters actually serving? The most interesting thing to me, like I said, was the Christophsis interlude, but it is one of my favorite interludes from the trilogy. For next week, let's read chapters 19, 20, and the interlude. This time, interlude 5 will take place on Coruscant. So chapter 19, 20, Interlude 5 on Coruscant, and that's what we will discuss next week. Please leave me a comment about what you think of the story so far. If you're not already, find us on all of the socials. I'd love to talk to you guys about this book as we go forward. You can find us on different platforms, and we have a Discord server, which I highly encourage you all to join. But that's what I have for today, and I will talk to you guys next week.